listener production.
Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to The Briefing. White supremacy, antisemitism and neo-Nazis have been making headlines lately in Australia. Just how worried should we be?
Australian neo-Nazis are very influential in the international English-speaking Nazi world.
In the second half of this episode, we're asking an expert on the far right what we need to know about the modern Nazi movement in Australia, who it's attracting, and whether enough is being done to combat the dangerous ideology. But first, it is time for the headlines with Helen Smith on Thursday, March 6.
Morning, Sasha. Morning, everyone. People from southeastern Queensland to northern New South Wales are bracing for tropical Cyclone Alfred, which has slowed on its path to making landfall. In its latest update, the Bureau of Meteorology pushed out the anticipated arrival of the Category 2 storm to tomorrow night. Now, at this stage, this could be directly over Brisbane at around 7 p.m, with the cyclone expected to cross over between Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast and Coolangatta at the Queensland-New South Wales border.
People in the impact zone are being warned to prepare for 3 natural disasters in one. That's according to the New South Wales SES. So this is going to be things like torrential rain, destructive winds up to 160 k's an hour. And the other thing is dangerous storm surges, which could cause flooding. They're all expected. Now, areas set to be impacted by Alfred are already experiencing damaging winds and large surf, and those conditions are expected to worsen today. In response, hundreds of schools right across the affected area have been closed for the rest of the week. Flights have been cancelled, as well as some public transport services.
And to get the most accurate information on how to get around, you can check TransLink if you're in Queensland and Trip Planner if you live in New South Wales. A reminder as well, the AFL season opener scheduled for tonight between the Lions and the Cats at the Gabba in Brisbane has been cancelled, along with the Suns v Bombers clash on the Gold Coast, while the NRL's clash between the Dolphins and the Rabbitohs tomorrow night has been moved to Sydney.
Yeah, so lots of things closing. Coles has said it's going to stay open as long as possible. And, you know, it is expected to be felt the most in that southeast Queensland pocket because that's where the actual cyclone itself is going to cross over. However, we know that that impact zone is stretching as far south as Grafton in northern New South Wales. So as we said yesterday, keeping our thoughts with everyone who is in those affected areas. And if you are in them, to get the latest on the storm, you can head to the ABC emergency website or tune into your local ABC radio station. Now, there is also the Hazards Near Me app if you're in New South Wales, or if you're in Queensland, head to the disaster management website, which is disaster.qld.gov.au.
The United States has cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine for the first time since 2022, showing further cracks in the relationship between Washington and Kyiv. The move's been confirmed by the CIA and comes just 2 days after Donald Trump paused military aid shipments to Ukraine, and a day after Volodymyr Zelensky's letter to the US president expressing he's ready to continue negotiations to end the war with Russia. So, to explain what this means in real terms, intelligence sharing is crucial for effectively combating terrorism, threats of war and cybercrime, for example. So when you're in the middle of a war, you really rely on it.
Yeah, and it's such a key thing that happens between allies.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the US has made this move is, you know, is pretty major. Look, moving over to Gaza now, the US and Israel have rejected a plan endorsed by Arab leaders for the post-war reconstruction of the Gaza Strip that would give almost 2.1 million displaced Palestinians somewhere to live. Now, the $84 billion plan was presented by Egypt at an emergency Arab League summit, with the Palestinian president urging Trump to support it. Now, this proposal is an alternative to Trump's idea, which was for the US to take over the Strip and permanently resettle its population. That's something that Israel, unsurprisingly, was on board with. And you may have seen that unbelievable AI video he posted to his social media accounts promoting those plans. Pretty wild.
And staying on the Trump train, the US president gave his first speech to the new Congress, and it wasn't short on drama. A Democratic congressman was evicted from the chamber early on, and others protested with small signs, some of them reading "Musk steals, save Medicaid, protect veterans, and that's a lie."
Mr. Green, take your seat. Finding that members continue to engage in willful and concerted disruption of proper decorum, the chair now directs the Sergeant-at-Arms to restore order Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
Texas Congressman Al Green, who was booted from the chamber, is a well-known Trump critic and is pushing for him to be impeached. He broke decorum by yelling. And over the roughly 100-minute-long address, the US president talked up his first 6 weeks back in office, including signing orders on DEI initiatives, setting up Doge and getting Elon Musk in, announcing tariffs and ending wokeness.
A bit of rage bait for the ladies this Thursday morning. Aussie men are still doing the same amount of housework that they were 20 years ago, with women spending an average of 6 hours more on chores a week than their male counterparts. So this is according to one of my favourite ongoing research pieces. It's called the Annual Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia, or HILDA report, and it surveys the same 17,000 people every year, and it's been going since 2001, and its latest paper has found men spend an average of 12.8 hours on housework a week compared to 18.4 for women. The outrage, and that's despite females spending 6 more hours in paid work than they were 2 decades ago.
Yeah, and blokes comparatively have only increased their working hours by 0.2 hours in the same period. And in 2022, women still took on most of the caring duties, almost double the amount of men, with 10.7 hours a week in 2022, an increase on the 10.1 hours spent in 2002. Oh, and if you're wondering, males are more satisfied with the division of labour than females are.
No kidding. Yeah, I read that most women feel like they do more than their fair share at home, whereas men usually believe they share the housework and care fairly with their partner. So it's really interesting, Helen, that there's this disconnect between women and men in hetero relationships who are living together, and they're just, the women, and so many women I speak to are frustrated at the level of work they do, whether it's running errands, whether it's cooking and cleaning and looking after the kids or looking after a grandparent or whatever it might be, and feeling like their male partner just doesn't step up to the plate. But the male partner goes, yeah, I think I do my fair share. It's honestly bizarre. There's something, we've got to investigate men's brains to figure out what is happening here, because I know so many women who feel exactly the same.
Yeah, it's a really bizarre situation because, you know, some men do their fair share, but not all of them comparing clearly with this research here. But yeah, it would be fascinating to do a little bit of a what's going on up there.
Something, obviously. Look, and that's not to say that all men are the same.
No.
Obviously, I know lots of men who do plenty of their fair share of work at home. But yeah, this report always just gets me really riled up. Okay, thank you so much. Look, next up, we are changing pace. We're getting into a deep dive looking at what the modern neo-Nazi movement looks like in Australia right now. Should we be worried about neo-Nazis in Australia? It feels like the far-right white supremacist movement is growing in Australia. If not by literal size, then at least by how much it's being reported on in the media. We've seen rallies in Adelaide, Nazi salutes in Melbourne, and politicians racing to legislate tough new penalties to crack down on those displaying any sort of solidarity with the ideology. So how big is the neo-Nazi movement here in Australia right now? What does a modern-day Aussie Nazi look like? And are we doing enough to stop them? Dr. Kaz Ross is an independent researcher into the far right, and she joins me now. Dr. Ross, what does an Australian neo-Nazi look like in 2025?
That's an extremely good question. Many people think that a neo-Nazi is a man with a shaved head, lots of tattoos, gets into fights, drinks heavily. And yeah, sure, there are some that look like that. But nowadays, a neo-Nazi could be anybody. It could be your dentist. It could be your trainer at the gym, could be somebody in your office. It will be a man, and Australian neo-Nazi organisations are set up for men, although they have auxiliaries for women. But the neo-Nazi will be a man. He could be a young man. He doesn't drink, doesn't have tattoos, has a professional career. So it's impossible nowadays to just look at someone and decide that they're a neo-Nazi or not. Of course, there are a few that have swastika tattoos and that kind of thing, but they are in the vast minority these days in Australia.
What would you say are the main ideological beliefs of neo-Nazis? Is it kind of the same as the Nazi Party of Germany from the 30s and 40s, or has it evolved to include more things to add to the hate list?
They basically see Hitler as the greatest man that ever lived, and as the leader of the neo-Nazis in Australia has said recently, there are two great men in history, Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler. So they hold Hitler up as the big success story, and what they think successful about Hitler is they see him as someone who successfully reconstructed his country, united the country around national identity, reformed the economy, gave a sense of pride to Germany. They're the achievements of Hitler that they look to. And of course, to achieve those goals, Hitler had to exterminate a lot of people, Jewish people, gypsies, communists, gay people, disabled people, and so on and so forth. That genocidal aspect of Hitler, which we're all horrified by and shocked by, and that's what we remember the most, for them that's a secondary, sort of a technique to achieve their aim, which is a pure blood nation, which is what they thought that Hitler was trying to achieve. They basically followed that, pretty well that exact same procedure for getting a pure white Australia. Their idea is that anybody who's not white needs to leave Australia. And that starts with international students, asylum seekers, people who are on working visas, and then they'll go that 2 or 3 or 4 generations. So if you're someone whose parents migrated here from somewhere else in the world and they're not white, then they would like to put you on a boat and ship you off. Some of them have even talked about deporting Aborigines. And when asked, well, where would you deport Aborigines to? They've been here a long time. They said, well, probably back to India, but we don't care as long as it's not here. So they take Hitler as an inspiration, and they say that they're not into genocide. But when you look at their program, which is to get rid of everybody who's not white, how else are they going to do it?
So, the Nazis of Germany in the 30s and 40s, you mentioned there were looking to not just exterminate anyone who wasn't white, but also ideological beliefs that were different, gay people, the disabled, gypsies. Do we see similarities with neo-Nazis in Australia? Like, are there other groups that they don't feel should be part of Australian society aside from race groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that people don't understand about neo-Nazis. They think that they're just anti-Semitic against Jewish people, and that is true. That's their core belief. But their most used insults are actually around sexuality, homosexuality, trans people, bi people, non-binary people. So they've turned up at drag queen story times in libraries, protesting. They protested in Melbourne on the steps of Parliament at a Let Women Speak rally. They turned up to support that. And they were using homophobic and transphobic slurs against gay people. So I say their most hated group is Jewish people, because they think that Jewish people rule the world and they're controlling the destruction of Australia. But then their second group would definitely be people that are sexually diverse. And then, of course, it's down to even the humble academic like my good self. I've been informed that I'm not getting into Nazi heaven because of my beliefs, which is a relief to me, I can tell you now.
I shouldn't laugh, but, you've got to find the humour, I suppose, sometimes in these situations. Look, we know anti-Semitism is an issue in Australia right now, and politicians want us to believe that it's a growing issue and it's something that is an increasing threat to Jewish communities. Can we put that down to neo-Nazism, or is there something else going on in there, when we look through the lens of what's happening with the war in Gaza?
Yeah, I think there's 3 elements that have unfortunately come together here. The first is, of course, neo-Nazis have been talking about the Jewish plot, and the destruction of Australia through migration is a Jewish plot, and the Jews control the banks and the Jews do this and so on and so forth. They've been talking about that since forever. But what we did see is during the COVID period, when suddenly a lot of people started to say, hey, what's going on with this COVID? It's a plot from the World Health Organization. It's the World Economic Forum. And people started to go down a conspiracy rabbit hole. And of course, the further you go into conspiracies, you just hit anti-Semitism. So the idea during the COVID, which was, the powers are after our children, they're preying on our children are, the mole children are being held in tunnels under Melbourne and all that sort of thing. Actually, that tracks back to antisemitism, this centuries-old belief that Jews are preying on the blood of Christian children. Then, of course, since October 7 last year, the actions of Israel in Gaza and the way that that's played out in Australian politics, an increase in the hate crime legislation, people being arrested for doing Hitler salutes or drawing swastikas and all that kind of thing, has increased people's notion of anti-Semitism, that they feel that Zionists get a special deal in Australia, that Zionists had more power than other people, and that, of course, feeds into the same anti-Semitism narrative. I'd like to also point out that a number of the people that have been convicted of doing Hitler salutes and drawing swastikas aren't actually Nazis. This is a real issue. I see very few, actually, of the Nazis that I research and follow and observe. I see very few of them being charged under this sort of legislation. And it's usually, some drunken guy at the footy or some teenager with a Sharpie pen at the bus stop that are the ones that are being pulled up. So I think those three things come together, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm curious what you think that means then, because to me, I see, the organised rallies, even though, I'd look at that and say 40 blokes with balaclavas thinking they're tough isn't particularly threatening. But the question then is, if they're not getting charged, the ones in Adelaide were charged, but if the leaders of these organisations are kind of seeming to slip through the cracks and people who are, doing a Nazi salute at the footy or the kid at the bus stop are getting charged, is that telling us then that the ideals of neo-Nazism are seeping wider into society in Australia, or were those people already kind of engaged in those groups? Like, what do you think we can learn from that?
Yeah, I think that there's a sense of crisis in Australia, that people feel that the cost of living, the housing, all of these issues are having a big impact on their life. And the people with the ready narrative to explain that are the far right. And that is to blame immigration for every issue that Australia ever faces. So if you can't rent a house or you can't get a place at university, you can't get a job, you blame immigrants. And it's the far right and the neo-Nazis that are pushing that line. And they're saying, look, it's all about immigration. The housing issue is all about immigration. And of course, who's pushing immigration? It's the Jews. It's their anti-Semitism line. And what's the solution? The solution is not just to stop immigration, but to throw people out of the country. So that I see that idea taking root much more widely. And some of the fringe party and politicians are already talking like that. In the case of the neo-Nazis, they turned up in places like Melbourne at a asylum seeker rally yelling, "F off, we're full." And under just normal decency laws, the police could have charged them with that. You can't go around yelling that at people in the street. Yet they did do that, yelling at people in the street. And it's taken till Adelaide, which was in, Australia Day or Invasion Day, in 2025, for them to be charged with displaying Nazi symbols on their jackets and things. In terms of whether or not they're growing, and we look at 40 people in balaclavas and think, yeah, big deal. 4 years they were nowhere. Now they've got hundreds and hundreds of men meeting every single week to do what they call train and tribe. So their model is called the Active Club model. And the idea is that men get together and they get fit. They work out, they do weights, they do running, they do boxing, they do mixed martial art, that kind of thing. So they're training. And the tribe is they form a community. And that community is based on the ideology of Hitlerism, of Nazism. So I think they've had a dramatic growth. Certainly even this year, they've had a huge growth as people think, it's not so bad to be a Nazi. Hitler wasn't such a bad guy after all. And anyway, I'm just going out doing boxing with my mates. But you have to wonder if they're training, what are they training for? And they think they're going to take power. They think there's going to be a race war, and they're pretty well training for that.
What other tactics are they using for recruitment? Are they using online methods, as we've seen with, say a group like ISIS, which that was its main recruiting tool, especially for people overseas? Is this movement similar, or is it mainly grassroots, mainly on the ground, trying to get into communities and particularly focusing on teenage boys?
Their online recruiting is extremely successful. So they recruit through the gaming platforms. such as Steam or Discord. They will target young people through roadblocks, which is, something that kids do online. They, of course, use word of mouth, get their mates in. They are in the comments section. So Channel 9 or Channel 7 does an expose of Nazis. People are talking about it on Facebook. They'll jump into the comments section and they'll start looking for people that look sympathetic. Twitter or X is one of their main places for connecting with people, as is TikTok and Instagram. They are very, very effective at using the online space. They produce quite a bit of propaganda. And many of their stunts, when they turn up, we've got 80 people marching around in black singing Waltzing Matilda very badly. The whole idea of that stunt, there's two things they're trying to achieve there. One is to create content. So really cool video of them marching around, looking cool with a bit of speeches thrown in. That's one of their aims. And the second one is to create a conflict with the police. So they create a conflict with the police and then they can use that to say, see, we're being targeted. We're just good guys. We were just singing Waltzing Matilda. Why are the police targeting us? And then people think, yeah, that's right. Why can't you sing Waltzing Matilda on Australia Day? Of course you should be able to do that. They're not so bad after all. So they're very clever at manipulating the media, confronting the police in a way that benefits them and making a lot of online content. Australian neo-Nazis are very influential in the international English-speaking Nazi world.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is a neo-Nazi in Australia, do they look different from one that's in Europe or in America? Is there an international network that they're all kind of filtering down through, or does Australia have its own movement and thus looks particular to Australia?
We have our own movement and it does look particular to Australia, despite the fact you'd think that we'd be very similar to America, which is also a colonial settler society. Probably our closest links are with the UK and with the US. The neo-Nazi movement in Europe is quite a different creature with a really different kind of history. It's easy to say if you come from somewhere like Sweden, our ancestors have been here for centuries, this is our homeland for thousands of years, we don't want immigrants. It's a bit harder to say that in Australia, where white people have only been here just over 200 years. You can't really claim we are from the land, this is blood and soil, which is the slogan from Hitler's Germany. We have a connection to the land, blood and soil, when we've only been on the land less than 300 years.
Look, the question then, I guess, Dr. Ross, is how do we fight this? And because everything you've explained is that this is a serious threat and something that is happening and something that is growing. So how do we fight it? And is things like, the strengthening of anti-Semitic and terrorism legislation, which have been done in response to recent anti-Semitism in Australia, is that the answer, or do we need to do more?
A knee-jerk reaction people had, which is you turn on the telly or you're walking in the street, suddenly you see 70 guys dressed in black, holding up a horrendous banner with some kind of racist or homophobic slur, yelling offensive slogans, and you think, wow, we really need more laws to combat that. But that kind of approach, more laws, more policing, doesn't actually solve the problem. Some people say that it makes them more attractive because they're like Ned Kelly outlaws. I'm not sure if that is the case. The problem we've got is that for young people and for young men, at the time when they're sort of having identity formation, they're becoming adults, about 15, 16, often they're exposed to looking at World War II in the curriculum at school. And that's certainly one path where people become a bit Hitler obsessed, because the images they see of Hitler would be gorgeous young men dressed in Hugo Boss uniforms. They don't actually see the ugly Nazis and the ugly side of it. So the way that we're educating around World War II, and of course they should learn about the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust and what happened, the way we're educating about it can actually sort of push them in the direction of being more intrigued rather than say, yeah, actually, I know what was going on there and I don't approve or I don't agree of it. So I'm not in that education space, but I have heard experts talk about it and they say this is a danger, that we really focus on Hitler at a time when these young men are, having their identity formation. So that's one question. What's our education around the Holocaust and Nazis? The other issue is that we do have problems in a society with things like housing and immigration, and we need to have open, transparent and public discussions of those. rather than closing those discussions down. Because when we close those discussions down, then it's a space for conspiracies to come up. So that's the second thing. We do have living conditions that need to be addressed. But I think the most important thing is that there is no alternative. If your son or your brother or your friend, you can see them going down this path, they're just a young person, they're going down this path, there are no support services for you. What are you going to do? Nobody really wants to ring the police on their own child. So there's no sort of community organisations, non-government organisations to support you as a family. What can I do? How can I talk to my child? There's no national de-radicalisation program. It's all devolved to the states. So each state takes a different approach. Often for these young men, I see recruited into the neo-Nazis. They could be on the autism spectrum. They may not have a lot of friends. They haven't done well at school, and they find a home with the neo-Nazis. They're basically, if you join the neo-Nazis as a 17-year-old, you are wrecking your future. And this is something that the neo-Nazis kind of prey on. The other element of it is coercive control, but once you're in, it's like a cult, very hard to leave. And this is also for the girlfriends of the neo-Nazis. Their strategy is for those to get the young girls when they're just teenagers, to get them pumping out the kids as soon as possible by the age of 20, and to basically get them where they're in a coercive control situation where they feel like they've got no friend and no resources. They can only rely on neo-Nazis. They've got nowhere to go. So all these elements, that's a cult-like element, it's coercive control. We need community-based organisations that can help people navigate this for the loved ones in their lives that are getting sucked into this kind of thing.
Dr. Kaz Ross, I feel we've only just scratched the surface, but we do appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
You're very welcome.
That was independent researcher Dr. Kaz Ross speaking with me there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. We do appreciate your time today. Before you go, it would be really great if you could share this ep with someone who you think might get something out of it or find it interesting. It is a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. And so is sharing our socials posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast or on TikTok. We're also on YouTube. For both of those, you can just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Catch you next time.
Listener.